Thank you, Will and Tom, for that lovely introduction, and for all your hard work today for keeping the seminar going. I'm very excited to share a portion of my PhD research today. As Tom explained, is on funerary rites and fantasy literature. Today we'll be looking specifically at cremation. So as we all will probably know, cremation is a mode of bodily disposal and funerary rites that can be traced back thousands of years, from the urns used by Romans to contain their loved ones' ashes, to extensive long barrows in which both skeletal and cremated remains, also known as cremains, were interred, such as in Stony Littleton Long Barrow, as you can see just here. Yet the greatest change in the perception of cremation has only occurred within the past 100 years. We can actually see this change charted statistically. If it will let me, there we go. From early percentages of 0.01% of those who died in the mid-1800s in the UK being cremated to 78% in 2020 alone. This is a practice that would have seen you arrested and tried, like Dr. Price, in 1883, which is a fascinating story that I recommend you go research yourself, as I don't have time to get into it today. But however, cremation is now at the cutting edge of funerary science, with colloquially known green cremation processes, such as alkaline hydrolysis or aquamation, being available to the public. Such names seem more at home in a science fiction novel, and it's the potentialist gap between reality and fantasy that is the wider focus of my PhD. But for today, we'll be looking at J.R.R. Tolkien's depiction of cremation in his Middle-earth. As argued by Amendt-Raduege in her book The Sweet and the Bitter, Tolkien's depiction of cremation is distinctly and predominantly negative, as seen through the lens of the bad death, as outlined by the medieval genre of ars moriendi, or the art of dying well. Today, I argue that you can look at Tolkien's depiction of cremation specifically through the lens of his Catholic faith, the church of which banned cremation until 1963. The extent of how Tolkien's faith influenced his work is heavily debated, as we've already heard today, but the central value of preserving bodily wholeness for the purpose of resurrection in the Catholic faith is, I argue, too strong to not at least consider. And one example of this we can see is a record of a discussion between the Inklings, as recorded in a letter by C.S. Lewis to his brother, that they actually discuss cremation. And Tolkien is one of the people who is vehemently against it, just in terms of the idea of the human corpse was the temple of the Holy Ghost. So this value of bodily wholeness also goes beyond individual faith in particular, as it permeates the cultural world building of Middle-earth itself through funerary rites, with the secondary world echoing primary world values. However, I argue that this link isn't a simple copy and paste, but a two-way correspondence where complex depictions of cremations open up discussion through the lens of fantasy, specifically our relationship with the dead and how we mediate that through funerary rites and how we memorialize the dead. How much of that empathy process is solely reliant on a physical body? To explore this, we'll be looking at three different ways Tolkien interprets the cremation process, through four examples: cremation as disposal, the mass burning of orcs; the phenomenon of self-cremation through Feanor and Denethor; and cremation as an alternative funerary rite through the burned Dwarves of Azanulbizar. But first, a quick outline of the relationship between Catholicism and cremation. So one of the earliest shifts in attitudes to cremation was that of Emperor Constantine in the 5th century AD, in which he banned cremation as a normative funerary rite in the Roman Empire in favor of burial. This indicated an increased influence of the Christian faith, in particular the preservation of the body for both post-death resurrection. The Catholic Church, most likely in response to the growing support and legalization of cremation, declared an official ban on cremation in 1886, emphasizing how it denies resurrection. However, in 1963, the Code of Canon Law was updated and thereby lifted the ban on cremation, quoting the reasons for doing so as relating to social and economic factors. The emphasis on burial preference and the potential blasphemy from the act of cremation still stands, although the updated Code of Canon Law in 2016 reduced the sense of hierarchy between burial versus cremation and recognized cremation as equally valid, providing that the ashes aren't divided or scattered, again, emphasizing bodily wholeness, even if it is a more illusionary understanding of the term. And here we have the 1963 quotations and the 2016 quotations. So our first example is the most common reason for cremation in Tolkien's work is to dispose of enemy corpses, most often orcs, such as the Rohirrim's post-battle burning of the orcs who kidnapped Merry and Pippin in the Two Towers. Here we have Eomer recounting what happened. We counted all the slain and despoiled them, and then we piled the carcasses and burned them, as is our custom. The ashes are smoking still. The word carcasses evokes the idea of waste and bodily corruption, which suggests a form of purification and disposal via fire in an attempt to remove the lingering evil embodied by the orcs, even more so with the additional animalistic connotations of the term. For example, you wouldn't necessarily say pig corpse, you would say pig carcass. These connotations bring to mind Helen Young's analysis of orcs as the racial other, with the, quote, dehumanizing animal imagery echoing colonial discourses of the superior human and the inferior animal binary being imposed on the dead orcs, reinforcing their inferiority, even in death. This idea of waste disposal is supported by the common framing of body disposal through the lens of hygiene, pollution, and environmental protection, as argued by Tony Walter. And this is both physically and symbolically. The act of mass cremation can also be read as a cleansing of the land. The slain invaders are denied any kind of post-death presence in Rohan by physically reducing them to ash. And both the great plume of smoke and the great goblin head on the stake act as a visible marker of this battle, declaring the Rohirrim's victory and deterring future attempts to encroach on their land and authority. The pile of orc corpses echoes more ancient modes of cremation, such as that of the funerary pile, and emphasizes the reduction of the enemy to a large mass rather than individuals, in contrast to the nearby mound for the fallen Rohirrim riders that commemorates them as a warrior collective. Yet it still emphasizes their individuality via the encircling planted 15 spears that surrounds the mound. The emphasis that Eomer puts on this mass cremation of enemies being our custom highlights how the physical disposal and reduction of the orcs ties into the cultural and societal values of Rohan. A warrior society that prioritizes individual memory within a communal culture by incorporating their funerary rites with the land itself, connecting this idea of physicality to memory. So here we have the second example of cremation that really stands out in Tolkien's legendarium is that of Feanor, or at least that is how one might interpret what happens to his body at least, and shows how the unique nature of elven thanatology can help unpack the relationship between the body and an individual's identity in Middle-earth funerary rites. The passage describing his death focuses on his son's inability to bury him in a mound after his final fatal battle with Gothmog the Balrog, due to his bursting into flames after his death. Then he died, but he had neither burial nor tomb, for so fiery was his spirit, that as it sped, his body fell to ash and was borne away like smoke, and his likeness has never again appeared in Arda, neither has his spirit left the halls of Mandos. The emphasis on Feanor having neither burial nor tomb establishes burial as the traditional form of bodily disposal for elves when a body is recovered. Tolkien's explanation of Feanor's spontaneous combustion as a literal manifestation of his fiery pride both emphasizes how the body reflects the soul in the process of disconnection that characterizes the elves' immortality and the recurring Tolkienian idea of cremation as a form of symbolic purification, or in this case, potential divine punishment. Comparisons can be drawn with Denethor, especially as both are arguably cremated as a result of their pride. However, the internal burning of Feanor's flames points towards something else, specifically a disintegration of the self and a lack of harmony between body and soul. This recurring disintegration is key to Tolkien's negative presentation of cremation, as it emphasizes how a lack of a body to inter and thereby become a funerary landmark, such as a burial mound, prevents the person from being fully integrated into their society's cultural memory, leading to their becoming a disembodied outcast in how they are memorialized. Now, a good example of this would be Denethor, of this outcast effect, and his death by self-immolation. His death is depicted thusly. Breathed in fire and smoke, he took up the staff of his stewardship and broke it on his knee. Casting the pieces into the blaze, he bowed and laid himself on the table, clasping the palantir with both hands upon his breast. And it was said ever after, if any man looked into that stone, he saw only two aged hands withering in flame. An immediate point of contrast between Feanor and Denethor is that Denethor's post-death bodily state isn't technically self-cremation, but rather self-immolation. Whilst this is a little bit pedantic in terms of a difference, I think it's important when it comes to the role of agency in the theme of self-cremation, as self-immolation occurs while the person is still alive, and is thus their cause of death, and is performed by the individual himself, rather than another person. Moving on to Denethor himself, his resulting self-cremation is not performed on him as a punishment for his action, but rather is enacted by himself due to a combination of pride and despair. This act of suicide is the primary reason why Denethor's death is a bad death, as this categorization depends on cultural interpretation, as Amendt-Raduege argues, such as the negative view of suicide in some Christian belief systems, specifically the medieval belief that the manner of your death reflects your life's moral quality. Of course, that's a very old idea, specifically within the Catholic faith, and has been denounced several times. The disintegration of Denethor's body in fragmented legacy via a potential form of haunting projected by the palantir can be read as a form of punishment. Not only has he become physically isolated as he is reduced to a pair of aged hands withering in flame, but his post-death memory and legacy is isolated from the rest of his society, as the traditional Gondor funerary custom of entombment can't be performed, at least not to the extent of previous stewards or kings in the tombs. This emphasis on isolation is part of how Denethor's death can be classified as a bad death within the Ars Moriendi model, as argued by Amendt-Raduege, as he rejects the warrior's death that is valued in Gondor society, both in militaristic deeds, but also he betrays his responsibility as steward to his people by giving in to despair, contrasting with his own son's Boromir's fulfillment of a good death. There's also a level of cultural treachery as he abandons the funerary rites and associated values of bodily preservation of his people, instead reverting to the funerary pyres of the heathen kings of old. Yes. This treachery can even be expanded to that which disturbs the cosmic order, as Raduege argues, as both Denethor's attempt to manipulate Sauron and burn Faramir when he is alive evidence his attempt to take power and authority that is not his to take. One aspect of Denethor's death in the text that mirrors some of the film's graphic detail is the underlying context of attitudes to death in Gondor. His death has been made invisible, echoing early Númenórean death knell. However, Denethor's death makes death violently visible again and potentially strikes at the heart of this taboo. By contrast with the Rohirrim's use of cremation as a disposal method, there's a very interesting example of cremation being used as an alternative method of body disposal without the previously analysed negative associations. The Battle of Azanulbizar, which I do hope I'm saying correctly, in which the exiled dwarves of Erebor fight to reclaim Khazad-dûm or Moria, concludes with a vast number of fallen dwarven soldiers. Due to the lack of resources in a time of war, the surviving dwarves were unable to bury their comrades in stone, as is their custom. So instead, they built funerary pyres and cremated them. And I have the exact quotation here. So it was that after Azanulbizar, the dwarves dispersed again. But first, with great labour, they stripped all their dead so that orcs should not come and win there a store of weapons and mail. It is said that every dwarf that went from their battlefield was bowed under a heavy burden. Then they built many pyres and burned all the bodies of their kin. The attempt to honour their dead, whilst also being unable to do so traditionally, emphasises this funerary event as one of tragedy, especially in the context of the dwarven belief that they will aid Anuel, their creator, in the remaking of Arda after the last battle, aka a form of delayed resurrection, in contrast with the physical loss of the body in cremation. The additional focus on the sheer number of fallen dwarves echoes the idea of the collective mass of dead who have lost their individual identities, in contrast with the dwarven emphasis on individual identity and memory, such as on Balin's tombstone, which reads, Balin, son of Fundin, Lord of Moria, in the Fellowship of the Ring. The first line emphasizes Balin's paternal identity through his connection to his father, followed by the title, which was the source of his power and status. While these details could be argued to be based on Balin's communal identity, the emphasis is still on Balin the individual, as his name is the main priority within the inscription. Tolkien scholar Simone Barrecci has compared the tragic depiction of the mass unknown dead to the dead of World War I. Tolkien himself witnessed this mass anonymous death as both a soldier and a civilian, and was part of a post-war society who had to formulate new ways of mourning and honouring the dead. How the dead of Azanulbizar are remembered offers an alternative to this sense of helplessness that comes from being unable to honour the dead. While the act of cremation challenges the dwarven thanatology of resurrection, the way in which they remember and incorporate these fallen dwarves into their cultural memory may offer consolation and meaning to their death anxiety. Such dealings with their dead seemed grievous to the dwarves, for it was against their use, but to make such tombs as they were accustomed to build, since they will lay their dead only in stone, not in earth, would have taken many years. To fire, therefore, they turned, rather than leave their kin to beast or bird or carrion orc. But those who fell in Azanulbizar were honoured in memory, and to this day a dwarf will say proudly of one of his sires, he was a burned dwarf, and that is enough. There's a recurring emphasis on protecting the bodies from post-death mutilation, which upholds Tolkien's theme of bodily wholeness being a priority within the different thanatologies of Middle-earth. However, this adaptation is a very rare deviation from Tolkien's largely negative presentation of cremation, and suggests some fluidity in his approach to death denial and acceptance in relation to the physical body. Overall, this suggests that the fantasy genre's ability to offer alternative approaches to mourning and memorialization is very subjective, especially in the author's personal attitude towards certain funerary rites and the larger social context in which they were writing. After all, the Lord of the Rings trilogy was published about a decade before the legalization of cremation in the UK. Legalization by the Catholic Church rather than the UK, apologies. This, however, requires much more analysis to come to any conclusions, as well as looking at different fantasy texts to compare and contrast. But Tolkien's representation of cremation does offer an introductory example from which to develop further. And a conclusion. The exception of the burned dwarves points towards the flexibility of memorializing heroism when traditional burial cannot be performed, especially in the context of World War I and the rise of bodiless funerary memorials. The burned dwarves are united in their community, whereas Denethor, Saruman, and Feanor are all isolated from their communities. Overall, the physical isolation of these figures is echoed in their physical states post-death, as the inability to bury them or honour them via funerary rite isolates them from their own communities and their larger social memories. However, in the case of the burned dwarves, even in a situation where their most ingrained traditions are denied to them, they can still remember their fallen comrades with pride. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Hollie, for a really interesting exploration of cremation and its analogs in Middle-earth. So we have a couple of questions from the chat here. I have one from Adam, which is says, Hollie, Saruman's death is described thus. About the body of Saruman, a grey mist gathered and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire as a pale shrouded figure it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking into the west, but out of the west came a cold wind and it bent away with a sigh dissolved into nothing. What do you make of the fact that Saruman has turned to smoke as if cremated? And do you have any thoughts on Saruman's wavering turn west? Or, for instance, asking for forgiveness, waiting for judgment, question mark?
Absolutely, yeah. I do explore the Saruman death situation in my larger chapter. I just couldn't fit in this one, unfortunately. But yeah, I definitely agree that you could interpret Saruman's death as a form of cremation, like you said, with the metaphor of smoke. Like there's definitely the very, very strong similarities there. And I've always found this sort of the we turn to the west like incredibly tragic, because it's almost as if him turning to smoke and to ash means that he is being fully denied that chance, even if he does want to return to the west. The powers that be are just like, no, Oh, you don't get to.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a very evocative image. Absolutely. We have another question from CG Lodgson here in the Q&A, which is, do you have any further comment on the way Denethor's death also disrupts the entombment of other key figures in Gondor's history, seeing as it destroys the whole portion of the building along with him?
Absolutely, yeah. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, so there's that longevity of sort of ruining it for everyone else. So it seems to be pointing towards a definitive moving away from Denethor's stewardship and how Gondor was underneath that. And then Aragorn coming in, whether or not he would be the kind of king to restore that and try and fully go back to the traditions of, you know, the tombs and the inferred embalmment. And you can definitely read into that, whether or not it's fully sort of like trying to conserve the past or moving forward with a new interpretation of it. But yeah, I hadn't realized that that would actually have destroyed part of the text.
Thank you. There's some significance, I think, to the fact that entombment is not necessarily presented as a unalloyed positive in Tolkien's world, that it reflects this clinging to the past and in fact is a reflection of the Númenóreans' fear of death as opposed to a mere regard for the ancestors. We have another question from Gary. In Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien says that eventually all elven bodies will be consumed by their Fëa. Do you think this is related to the death of Feanor?
Absolutely, yeah. I haven't read Morgoth's Ring just yet. But yeah, it definitely seems that you could interpret what happens to Feanor essentially a speeding up of that process, whether it be because of his pride in particular that speeds up that process, whereas for everyone else it's a lot slower. It definitely points towards maybe that being like connected. But yeah, and then the physicality and the preservation of the body with the elves.
Great. Thanks. I've got one more question for you because we've got a little bit of time, which is, I was really fascinated by the parallel or the contrast you draw between the communal cremation, which is the dwarves at the Battle of Azanulbizar, and individual cremation among Feanor, Denethor, etc., and the distinction here between in the case of Feanor or Denethor, it's seen as, you know, a reflection of their pride, a reflection of their self-regard, their cult of the self, as one of our earlier presenters might have put it, Mariana and Taylor. And I'm curious, I wanted you to expand a little bit more on the communality of cremation or versus the individualism of this sort of auto cremation almost of Feanor and Denethor, etc.
Absolutely, yeah. It does seem to be a sort of individual cremation in particular in Tolkien's work is tied up very much with the self being a very like selfish concept, at least in the way that characters like Feanor and Saruman are presented. Whereas communally, so the communal cremation almost seems as if it's like post-death they are still together, whether they be like militaristic comrades or in the context of the dwarves, but it definitely seems to be leaning towards that like communal sense of sort of like you're unable to fulfill the traditional funeral, but as long as they are together, then sort of that like communal warrior identity is preserved. Almost that it's like that's almost better than the individual memorialization, which you can see in Rohan very much. But yeah, it definitely sort of gets to sort of the minutiae of that sort of Anglo-Saxon style warrior culture that Tolkien seemed to be quite inspired by.